What's up, everyone? I hope everybody's having a great day today. My name's Josh. Today we're going to talk about The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This is the adaptation of the novel by Suzanne Collins of the same name. And this is a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy, or quadrilogy, depending on whether you're talking about the books or the movies. I've read the books and seen the movies, at least the originals. I read the books when I was in middle school, right as the films were coming out, so it was really cool for me, at least, to read them and then immediately see the adaptations, and just the ability to experience these stories in two different formats back to back was pretty cool. I know the movies aren't perfect. A couple of them, particularly the two Mockingjay films, do have their flaws, but I enjoy them for what they are. However, I have not read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. And after seeing this, I definitely wish that I had. It does have a snappy title, but this is effectively the origin story to President Snow from the original films. And I don't know, most of the time I don't really care for villain origin stories, especially in this case. I think Donald Sutherland delivered exactly what we need from that character. And if this weren't based on a book, I wouldn't be one of the people who's like, yeah, this is something I would want to see. And this is a long movie. It's broken up into 3 parts. This review might feel a little like scattered thoughts because of that, but I'll try to be as organized as possible. Basically, when we start, Snow is a lower-class capital citizen. His father died recently fighting the rebels in the districts. He agrees to participate in the 10th Hunger Games as a mentor because the winner will be awarded a monetary prize, which he hopes to put towards his education to sort of bring his family back up to their status that they used to have. And that is something that intrigued me right off the bat. The Hunger Games series has always been about classism largely, but this brought a new light to that, and that we're seeing this from the Capitol's perspective here. In the originals, we just saw the Capitol as a bunch of rich assholes. But no, there are specific classes within the Capitol too. And when we start here, Coriolanus Snow is not among the wealthier families. And after he agrees to be a mentor, he winds up being paired with Lucy Gray, played by Rachel Zegler, who kind of seems like a lost cause. She's small, she doesn't have much experience fighting, and one thing that's interesting specifically about the games in this case is that this follows the 10th Hunger Games, not the 74th, like we pick up with Katniss' story in the original Hunger Games. So this is a time period in Panem where the viewership for the games is actually going way down. No one is watching them, and throughout the film, characters pose the question, what are the Hunger Games for? And this is the point where it started to become more about turning the tributes into spectacles for viewers to root for and against, instead of rather just being cannon fodder. And that makes it all the more disappointing to me that the tributes, including Lucy, are among the least interesting of the roster of characters here. This isn't really about the games themselves necessarily, but they do take up a decent chunk of the movie. And another thing that I found kind of cool is that this is a much more stripped down, primitive version of the games because they don't have the technology and the experience that they had during the 74th and 75th games to make them as complex. So what you see here is much more watered down, which was cool to see, but at a certain point, it almost felt like the game makers were just completely incompetent. I understand that they don't have the technological advancements that they would go on to have in the future, but for instance, there's a sequence in which a bunch of rebels bomb the arena that they're going to use, and instead of fixing it up at least first, they start the games anyways, and because of that, there are all sorts of different paths that the tributes can take that aren't supposed to be there, and it just felt really incompetent for what's supposed to be the rogue organization that runs this country. But like I said, this isn't really about the games, it's more so about Snow and his downfall. So how is the central character himself? Well, Tom Blythe is great. The whole cast is really, but he has a tough job here because there's a lot he has to convey without directly telling the audience, without dialogue, and we're going to get into some of that when I talk about the flaws of the movie. But yeah, Tom Blythe, he's great. We'll talk more about him soon. I want to talk more for now about the supporting characters because some of them are just as interesting, if not more than him. Josh Andreas Rivera as Sejanus Plinth was great. He's one of the few characters that has clear motivations through and through. He's complex and he just wants to do the right thing. It's an easy guy to get behind. And the contrast between him and Snow, because they start out as friends and you see this branching of paths, I wish there was more of that because it was really interesting when they were actually delving into that. I really liked Peter Dinklage as Dean Highbottom. He's the guy who created the Hunger Games. I mean, that's so interesting to think about. What's going through that guy's head? And we also get very little of that. I could have used more of that character. Jason Schwartzman as Lucky Flickerman. You can tell he's a Flickerman, that's for sure. He hosts this version of the Hunger Games. He has a lot of comic relief in there. Some of it felt a little bit out of place, if I'm being honest. But he was memorable, at least. I also do want to touch on Viola Davis real quick. She plays Dr. Gall, who is kind of, I think she was actually the head game maker, I can't remember. Regardless, she's sort of the mad scientist type who is developing the mutts that they're going to use in the game, the arena itself, and she's overseeing the entire thing. Extremely cheesy character. I think Davis knocks it out of the park with her performance, but she's a very quirky, unusual character, and like a lot of them in this film, we just don't really get to know her motivations and her backstory, and because of that, she comes off as extremely one-dimensional. She's cruel for cruelty's sake, and I just don't really care for that. And as far as Snow's growth goes, I feel like his development is inconsistent and difficult to read. The film does pose intriguing scenarios. For instance, during the games, the whole time you're wondering, is he rooting for Lucy to win the games because of the prize or because he's genuinely starting to care for her? But we get very little emotion from him until the third chapter, which is by far the worst and honestly is a total clusterfuck. It somehow achieves the feat of being both tedious and rushed at the same time. We go through a lot of story in a short amount of time, and because of that, a lot of the character revelations just don't feel earned. For instance, in the third act, Snow does something horrible to somebody that he was once really close with, and there are repercussions to that. After that, we get a really emotional scene where he actually sheds some tears. And what I'm sitting there thinking is that this is the first time we've ever seen any honest, raw emotion or reaction to anything that's happening in the film. Throughout the rest of it, you just don't really understand what his motivations are. And I think this might be a situation where in the books, you're able to understand his motivations much more clearly because there's a lot more narration. You have the ability to read his thoughts through the first-person POV. Whereas here, you look at his facial expressions and I'm not really sure how to read them. Also, there are about a dozen scenes that are just Rachel Zegler singing. And look, we get it. She has a great voice, but it was really excessive. Singing is a key part of her character at points in the film, and it's sort of how Snow intends to win the viewer's favor in the games, but they just keep putting more singing sequences in afterwards, and it feels really forced. And unfortunately, Lucy Gray is another really forgettable character. In the first Hunger Games movie, you got to know who Katniss was, you understand her motivations and her backstory, and at first I thought Lucy Gray was going to be that sort of character, a fuck the Capitol type character, but then she just becomes this superficial love interest, really a gimmick for us to question Snow's intentions throughout the games. And that's about it. I was really disappointed by how superficial some of these supporting characters were. There are some other things in here that I really like, though. The score from James Newton Howard is fantastic. The acting really does suggest that there is a great film buried in here somewhere, but the characters just don't feel grounded and complex like they did in the original films and the books. Through about 80% of this movie, I wasn't feeling much emotion. And some of the readers of the book have informed me that Snow is not intended to be a saint early on in the film. This is not a downfall of pure innocence into pure evil. He's flawed from the very beginning. But after 2.5 hours of this, I didn't feel like I gained a new perspective on him. I think this would have been a lot better if A, it focused more on how Snow influenced the games by making them more about the tributes themselves and getting the audiences to connect with them. B, by giving us narration or a character to confide his feelings with, like Tigress, for example. She's in this movie, but she's not very well utilized. And I feel like she could have been one of those characters that he opens up to a lot so we could contextualize his actions a lot better. And C, I think it really should have made us care more about Lucy Gray because she's in a significant portion of the film and they just didn't get me to care. I want to make it clear that I was very mixed on this. I absolutely do not hate this film whatsoever. I see so much potential in it. It just doesn't quite get there. So I'm going to give The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes 2.5 stars out of 5. It's very middle of the road for me. So keep in mind that if you're a big fan of the book, you'll probably like this adaptation because you'll probably understand the character motivations better, things that they just couldn't convey on the screen. But I stand by my opinion that even if a movie is an adaptation of a book, people who haven't read it should still be able to go into it and get the same amount of character growth out of it as the people who have read the book. That's where I think it lets down audiences the most and winds up being a fairly forgettable movie. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. Again, be sure to let me know in the comments what you think of it, and how would you rank the Hunger Games films? Maybe I'll make a video on that someday. While you're at it, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.